Jerry Crow of the Pacifica Historical Society and today's host of Footprints of Pacifica, the weekly show where we get together to discover and explore the lure and lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. The focus of today's show is ChrisHunter and his recent book on legendary locals, which was the subject of a talk at the February 23rd quarterly meeting of the Pacifica Historical Society at the Sharp Park Golf Course Restaurant. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Jerry. And that was a very, very exciting moment for me, and I was honored to be able to appear and talk about my book to that crowd. And I've always been a supporter, and it was fun. I hope this is a good show for people.
I think it certainly was, so let's go to the video.
Now represents an attempt to share some pictures and stories about some people that I thought were very interesting and deserving of attention. It is not, as I put in my story, all of the people in Pacifica. I did not try to duplicate the history book that already existed. It was a matter of trying to share with the people that might be interested in this book some of the perspective that I learned from Palm Beach and Pacifica and Key West about interesting people who have done interesting and active things. And again, it isn't everyone, it's the people that I could get pictures of and that I knew how to find. And so, the Story of Arcadia book, some of you might be interested. I collaborated with the Pacific Historical Society years ago, and Bill Drake with the first history book that came from Arcadia, and Kathleen and Jerry and people from the Historical Society put that together. And then Arcadia was so excited they opened an office in San Francisco and started doing books all over the Bay Area. Since then, they've used up all those and they've left. And they're still in, I think, North Carolina. But the Pacifica book was actually the first one of the Arcadia history books that was done. And then, as you all know, Jerry and Kathleen did one for Half Moon Bay, and there's been, I mean, if you go into a bookstore, you can see dozens of them, and that's how Arcadia works. It lets people do local histories without having to spend their own money or be there. It is not a self-publishing group, but because of the way that Arcadia works and does stories and books all over the country. I mean, Meg and I bought a little history book from Hibbing, Minnesota for her mother, which was where Bob Dylan grew up. But pretty much no one else other than people in Hibbing would be interested in that particular book. And that's what I've learned about Pacifica. Pacifica is interesting. The books about Pacifica are interesting to people from Pacifica. And I was very fortunate to do a story about a book about the Ocean Shore Railroad, which actually has a broader appeal. People in North Carolina railroad store buy a book about the Ocean Shore Railroad. People don't buy a book about Pacifica in New Jersey. And so there's a real difference in the way that the books are marketed. So the anecdote about this book is, after this came out, Aaron at Florey's Books wanted to have a book signing there for me, and I just adored Mary Florey. She's in my book, in this book. She's a wonderful, wonderful Pacifica legend in many ways. I had written a billion stories about different artists, everything from people who see UFOs to I actually brought Alan Drury once, when he had a new book, down to Pacifica. He was a friend of mine from Palm Beach. And Mary was thrilled with that. And Meg's mother came and read some poems at Mary's bookstore once. But so Aaron graciously had this book signing for this new book, and it turned out to be the most successful book signing they've ever had, which was really, really an honor to me and to the people who came out that day to talk to me and to read the book and to buy the book from Aaron. And it was an ego. It was a great ego boost for me, and I was very pleased to be able to do that for Florey's Books. But then I went to Costco last week, and some of the people that I work with had seen the book at Costco, and they were thrilled and very honored. They thought, "Oh, this is great!" They're really excited about it because it's Costco, like it's the big time. I didn't want to tell them that Florey's was the big time. Costco, I sat in a booth behind 2 movie tickets for however much money, and a little table with all my books there, watching people go by with massive amounts of toilet paper, massive, quantities of liquor. I mean, You sit in Costco for 2 hours, you know how much liquor is sold. Oh my God, that's every single cart had a case of liquor in it. And I felt like I was at the bottom of an aquarium. One of those little chests, you know, looking out. And I sold 6 books that day. And 4 of them were to Costco employees who live in Pacifica. Other people walked by me or talked and they didn't know where Pacifica was. These are people from South San Francisco. I'm not kidding. They didn't know where Pacifica was. They didn't know what Pacifica was. When they saw that it was here, there was a 12-year-old girl who was excited because I was an author. She lived in San Francisco. She had no idea what the book was about, but she was genuinely interested in having someone there talk to her. But she and her parents didn't buy a book. That was the most exciting conversation I had that day. Actually. other than here's a political point. An older gentleman came over and he looked at the book and he goes, "I live in San Bruno." I said, "Great." And he goes, "People who work for cities get paid too much money." And he still wanted to have a political argument. And I went, well, I'm really not here to talk about that. And I'm glad you have an opinion, but he didn't buy a book either. He didn't care about the book. He just wanted to talk about how much he hates government, I guess. Or that anybody who works for government gets paid a decent salary.
But he loves toilet paper.
And he had tons of toilet paper. But that was an interesting day for me because my ego boost was Mary Flores and local and people in Pacifica who had connections with me and connections with the people. And the biggest honor I had, and I want to say that one of the things that inspired me to write this book, Arcadia actually called me up and said, "What do you think? We're starting a new series called Legendary Locals, and they're going to go all over the country and do this in small towns and everywhere. And they wanted me to try to do it, and I thought, I think I could do that now, and I wanted to reconnect with some of what I had done over the 17 years I was working at the newspaper. And I thought of Ruth Boudinot, who was one of the first people I met, and she was a direct contrast to this woman who came into the office and was so brusque. And she was this wonderful, you all probably knew her or know of her. She was a Jefferson Union High School board member. The Oceana High School library is named after her. Amazing woman. And I got to spend some time with her early in the early 1990s. And I thought, I have a picture of her, and she's someone who I can use as a sort of an inspiration to look for other people. And one of the things that I really wanted to do with this book was to look for a combination of old-time people that were known and some new people that had made an impact that weren't in the history books, the other history books. And an example of that would be Rob Schneider, who I want to tell you is the only person from Pacifica that the people at Costco know. And so people 20 years ago or knew who Keith Hernandez was, but people today only know Rob Schneider from Pacifica. It's hard to figure out, outside of Pacifica, and then they go, so what? And I go, well, and I'm looping back in the Burt Reynolds story because the reason, not so much Rob Schneider has made a good living, a big living, with movies, and he was on Saturday Night Live, and so that was very important. But he's one of those celebrities who put back into the community. Over $1 million during the 10 years that the Rob Schneider Music Foundation supported the music programs in the elementary schools and the high school. In fact, it created a way for the high schools to recreate their music programs. It was a very honorable thing that he did, and he was spending a lot of his own money, but he was promoting, fundraising for it. He came to Pacifica, and he went to the schools, and he talked to kids. And I must have covered him a half a dozen times doing that. And so that's why I wanted, and also his brother was a city council person, and most of you know his mother, Pilar, was on the school board too. And so there was a family there that was interesting. His sister used to own the horse stables, but I understand that's been sold to a new owner now. So, and I know Pilar is either leaving or getting ready to leave or leaving Pacifica. But the point was, it was an interesting. He grew up in Pacifica, he went to Terra Nova, and so that combination of people who everyone knows, and Grace McCarthy being one of them, and the McCarthy family, Kremer family's here, and I was really honored to know Grace McCarthy. She was a tough, I don't know if I would have wanted to have been a student in one of her classes, but she was an amazing woman, and she told me the story once about as a little girl being on Pancho Villa's knee or something, and being connected to such a long-term history, and then coming to Pacifica and being one of those founding women of Pacifica, which always fascinated me too. One of the tiny little details, and in my book you can see there's a little story and a picture of the all-woman city council that happened in the 1990s after a recall. And there was a big political stink in Pacifica, and it turned out that the whole city council was made of women, and that made national news because it was so rare. And it was in the National Enquirer, it was in Serious News, it was everywhere. People were talking about the all-women city council. And Barbara Carr said things that would get me in trouble if I were to say them, about making jokes about that particular thing. But I used to tell people, you know, the real interesting thing is that there's never been an all-male city council in Pacifica. So everybody was all excited about an all-woman city council, but there's never been an all-male. Women have always been a part of the leadership of Pacifica. And I thought that was, and people went, really? Yeah. And they go, you're right. I never thought of it that way. And that was an interesting thing too. So what I wanted to do today is also I looped back with Ruth Bodena at the Flores book signing. Ruth's son came and talked to me about his mom, and he bought 8 books, which I think is the single largest purchase. And he wanted me to sign each one to different members of the family, different grandchildren. And we had a nice chat about his mom, and he gave me some insight into what she was like. But he was really touched that I remembered her, and that I thought that she had done a really special thing for Pacifica. And I know that this book does that for a group of people, and I'm just very proud of that aspect of it. Another thing that was honorable that I felt really good, a friend of mine said that when he read the book, he thought that's why he lives in Pacifica. That some of the anecdotes and some of the connecting tissue of the book brought up memories and issues for him that said that's why he loves Pacifica. So that was an honor too. And I thought I would just read a couple of the things that I put in about Pacifica. And one of them was like Pacifica politics. And I said Pacifica is truly a spectator sport in Pacifica. It's with back and forth battles between folks who would like the city to have a vibrant economic personality and those who prefer to keep the city a bedroom community with strong environmental protections. This was the case in the 1990s. Sometimes when I do talk about the history of Pacifica, I realize I'm talking about the 1990s, and people go, oh, well, it's all new now. And I go, well, no, you could be talking about the 1970s, you could be talking about the 1980s. There's a certain real strong through line in Pacifica that is true, no matter what you wish it was, or wish it was different, or like it. I mean, it's really true. There have been successful recall elections, removing council members who promoted a special tax measure, followed by the election of officials with similar political philosophies, as those who were just recalled. There's a little schizophrenia in Pacifica that everybody knows about. And Sue DeGree, and I'm honored that Sue came today, the council member. She was asking me, well, why am I in the book? And I said, well, because Sue is in the unique position as a longtime elected official who, if she runs for re-election and wins, will be the last person ever to serve 16 years in the Pacifica City Council. But the irony, of course, is that the public of Pacifica said we don't want people to serve any longer than 2 terms. And so at that same election, they re-elected Jim Vreeland as a city council person. So the same voters said, we want to elect someone for a 3rd term, and we want to prevent people from serving more than 2 terms. In the same election. So who knows what the future holds? But the reality is that Sue is the last person who will ever be able to have the opportunity to do it if the public wants her to do it. So it's and just being an elected official. So, as Sue and everyone here knows, debates on development extend for decades in Pacifica, with multiple public votes showing that public leans away from more typical development agendas. An underlying affection for the community, however, seems to connect nearly every issue and all politically active personalities in Pacifica. Battle cries of who loves Pacifica the most and who has lived there the longest are voiced by all sides of the political spectrum. You haven't lived here long enough. You don't know this. I love this. I love the beach more than you. No, I love the beach. For many years, I fought as an advocate to get the Pacifica City Council to figure out a way to charge for parking at the beach. People were furious about it. Well, we now, after 25 years, have parking at the beach. People were saying, no, you can't change what we have here. So,
it just takes time.
it just takes time. But it's also, there's no, far be it from me to say what should happen, because what has happened is Pacifica often is, I used to call it Brigadoon when I was at the pit, because the history of Pacifica keeps reappearing the same stories, the same issues, the same debates. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what I think about this right now, but I can tell you I wrote about highway widening stories in 1995,
Yes.
and it was the same project. It was the exact same project. So kill it or do it, but we'll just talk about it for 20 more years, I think. Jean Fassler, I mentioned Grace McCarthy, but Jean Fassler is someone, we have a street named after us. She was the very first mayor of Pacifica. When Lori Tinfowl became the city manager, people said she was the first city manager, but there was really a female city manager for about 6 months before Carl Baldwin became the first city manager. And that was a little anecdote of history that only all of you wonderful people who like history probably even knew about. Because people were like, no, Lori's not the first female city manager, but the first female city manager didn't make a big impact, but she was the first city manager. Anyway, the other interesting historical fact about Jean Fassler, other than her personality, is that she's also the only Pacifica political figure to ever become a Board of Supervisors member. And she was on the Board of Supervisors for a long time and had a lot to do with the history of the 60s and 70s of the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors. She is, if you go where I work now, if you go look at the pictures, it's really quite astonishing how long Jean Fassler was actually on the Board of Supervisors, much longer than she was on the City Council of Pacifica, and had a much greater impact on the county as a whole and her involvement with the coast and the politics and the legacy of the coast. She had many famous meetings on that yellow house that has since been torn down, right on the beach, right near the Taco Bell there. Interesting, her son, when I stood beside her son when that house was torn down several years ago, and he was telling me that the waves used to come in underneath the floorboards. I mean, this is kids growing up in this house, and this old, so we're not going to be building houses on the beach anymore, that's clear, but they got to grow up there, and she had many political meetings in that house with people who were involved, and again, a little anecdote that I tell people sometimes that's sort of a tragic moment in the foundation of the history of Pacifica. There was a man who was killed out in the sand on the night of the election when they were all celebrating the victory of making Pacifica a city, an incorporated city, and some people couldn't move a car, and they were pushing a car in the sand, and the car ran over this man and killed him. And it's a little anecdote of history that adds a little bit of, if you were writing a novel, it would be foreshadowing of problems to come maybe or something, but very few people know about that, because this gentleman who was killed, I mean, his family cared a lot at the time, but that was 50 years ago, 50 some years ago, and it's been lost in history. And that's why something like the History Society, something like these books, as imperfect as they might be, are so much better than nothing and so much more important for the future. And I would say that one of the things that I did do at the Pacific Tribune, foolishly sometimes I think, is that I kept getting promoted. So I kept thinking I was doing a really good job. And then I would look behind me and realize that I had also kept the job that I had before. and so they were getting a real good deal. And by the time I was the publisher, I was also the editor, publisher, reporter, photographer, sweep out boy. You know, I was moving the trucks around. It was a very interesting thing. And I started to, I'm not really dumb, but I did figure out that that had something to do with the industry of journalism. That when, before the internet, up till the end of the 1980s, newspapers were a license to print money. Bill Drake did very well for his family, owning the paper for 30 years. And you can look at the chart as over the last 20 years. I was very proud to keep it going, but you know, I got to tell you that when I left the paper 6 years ago, there were 7,000 subscribers, and there's about 3,000 subscribers now. So fewer and fewer people in Pacifica are getting their information from a historically unified area, or a unified source. And now it's blogs, and it's talking. And as someone who works for the government now, trying to get information to the public is more difficult. It used to be, you just send a press release to 3 newspapers and they distribute it and let people know. Even if they didn't like it, they would write some story about it at least. It doesn't exist anymore. You have to pick and choose, and then people are pretty much only interested in bad news. So you know, you can find bad news all the time, but good news is hard to find in newspapers, especially community news. So I just want to say how important the Historical Society is, and because it collects this information. And I also know that the people that clip there's probably less to clip now. I mean, I read the paper and there's less to clip. There's less of the kind of little bits of information. And I want to mention a historical aspect about anecdotes too. A woman and a friend of mine, while I was still at the Tribune, came in and she was concerned about something about her father. And this is a real anecdotal kind of information about the specificity of history. And so I said, well, let's look up in the archives, because at the time, pretty much for the last 20 years, I've been the only person to look through the Pacifica Tribune archives, microfilm archives, which they don't even make anymore. And so we found a story, and I swear to you, this was a story about a fight in a parking lot in South San Francisco at the Elks Lodge, where this woman's father had gotten hurt and injured, and the specificity of the details was amazing. And I could see this woman get some closure from reading this story that would not have been available. And unfortunately, I have to tell you, it's not going to be available for similar things in the future. So everyone's excited about the internet, and there's lots of ways for people to find out information. But it won't be this kind of information, and that's the detail that I think is important for this group, and why it's important to try to save what we have. Because if it isn't ever written in the first place, it won't be on the internet 20 years from now. And that's what's not happening now. Things like interviews with regular people are not happening to the same degree that they used to. Bill Drake used to say, you know, if somebody's cat was hit in Pacifica, there would be a story about the cat's name and the kind of collar it's wearing. I tried to do some of that, but you can't do that unless you have 5 people running around in the city all the time, getting paid to do that, and people support it. Both of those things have changed in our current culture. I did stories in this book about, I tried to cross-pollinate people from all sides of the political spectrum, from someone like John Curtis to someone like Cal Hinton, maybe conservative, liberal, progressive, people that showed the whole patchwork nature of Pacifica. in a way that I was trying to get that across. Some people have said that I did, and so that was very important to me. But also I mentioned Rob Schneider, but someone like John Stanley. You know, creature features. People my age that lived here watched this guy on TV when they were younger, or their children watched him. And he's an interesting, fascinating guy, lives in Pacifica. Jeff Raskin, Jeff Raskin basically invented the Apple Macintosh computer. He named it Macintosh for his favorite Apple, Northwest Apple. And he and Steve Jobs did not get together, which was why Jeff Raskin left Apple early in his career and tried to create his own computer company. And then just worked as a consultant and a writer. He worked for the Pacifica Tribune doing nature columns for me. This is one of the, I have to tell you, Jeff Raskin was one of the smartest people I ever met in my life. Jeff Raskin is Da Vinci smart. He was an amazing human being. And he would redo ancient organs in his house, and he did airplane, radio-controlled airplanes. And he wrote books about what the future of computer was going to be, with the humane interface, he called it, instead of the human interface. It was a humane interface about what the future of computers was going to be. Smartest man I ever personally knew. Amazing. Kevin Kelly's from Pacifica, lives in Valamar, started Wired magazine, was involved with the Whole Earth catalog. So much stuff. Some of you may have seen his work on the internet with the 10,000-year clock. Amazingly interesting people in Pacifica that a lot of normal Pacificans don't ever interact with. Then there's the people that everyone does interact with. We have Glenn Stenstrom here, who's been a hair cutter a barber for so many years, and also an Olympic athlete almost, right? I mean, just amazing people that I've had the opportunity to meet, talk to, some just wonderful people that have created my life for a big part. I don't have a hometown. My father was in the Army. I grew up in many, many different places. And I'm proud to say that I've been here for a quarter of a century now. So.
Oh, yeah.